If he was so damaging to Ukrainian security, why do you think Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine while Joe Biden was president?
I think Putin invaded Ukraine because he felt that the United States was not taking him seriously. And when he went into Georgia earlier in that last century, and certainly when he went into Crimea. So I think he felt that the United States was so interested in not engaging in any kind of a conflict with Russia that he was free to go about his business. I think also many of us saw what Putin was up to going back to 2007, and when he gave that famous speech in the Munich Security Conference. That he thought that the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Empire was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, and that he wanted to, if he could, reconstitute the Soviet Empire under the Russian flag, and that's what he's tried to do in Ukraine. And former President Trump never criticizes Vladimir Putin. He sided with Putin in Helsinki. When the issue came up, was Putin involved in our elections? Our entire intelligence community said, yes, he was. And Donald Trump said, I believe Putin. So I think the question is that Putin believes that the United States would not resist what he was about, but he is about trying to reconstitute the former Soviet Empire under his flag, the Russian flag.
Well, I don't know if you think Donald Trump has anything there, whether you think this would have happened under his presidency. But it is worth noting that even at this desk, when we've talked to, for instance, Oksana Markarova, the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., or even President Duda of Poland, we've asked them about their thoughts on a potential 2.0 and to the extent to which Donald Trump might compromise Ukrainian security. He was given several opportunities, we should note, last night to say that he hopes Ukraine wins the war. He wouldn't say that. He would only say he wants the war to end. But those two people I mentioned from Ukraine and Poland remind us Donald Trump provided lethal weapons to Ukraine when others would not. Does he deserve credit for that?
Well, he gets credit for that. Anytime we provide weapons to Ukraine to help stave off a Russian attack, obviously that person deserves credit. But the fact is that Donald Trump, what he wants to do is to solve the problem, is to sell Ukraine out. He has had multiple opportunities to say that Ukraine should be defending its territory, that we support them defending their own territory, that we support our NATO allies helping them to defend their territory. He refuses to say it because he really is trying to curry favor with a dictator, and that is Vladimir Putin. So I think it's no question that he would sell out Ukraine in a nanosecond rather than saying we're going to continue to wage this campaign.
He would sell out Ukraine. Well, I'll tell you what, Kamala Harris said last night that if Donald Trump had been elected, Vladimir Putin would be sitting in Kyiv right now. Do you think she's right?
I don't think he had to be sitting in Kyiv. I think that Kyiv would have fallen rather quickly unless the United States and our Western allies provided them with a measure to resist that. We didn't give them enough soon enough, and as a result of that, they're suffering tremendous losses. But we are doing much better, and I think that they are putting up a fight for their lives because their lives and their nation, they're at stake.
You're watching, of course, the situation in the Middle East, Mr. Secretary. We've talked about it quite a bit since the events of October 7th. Donald Trump said last night that Kamala Harris, if elected, would mean the end of Israel, that Israel would not exist, he said, within 2 years. Do you see any daylight between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden when it comes to policy on Israel?
No. As a matter of fact, I've known Joe Biden for almost 50 years. I know that Joe Biden has been one of the strongest supporters of Israel during his entire career. And there's under no circumstances would Joe Biden ever sacrifice Israel's right to defend itself and our ability to help them defend themselves. And so the notion that either Joe Biden or his successor, Kamala Harris, would sell out Israel is absurd. And I think that's just another one of those provocations that Donald Trump is trying to perpetrate on the American people. Israel has the strong support of this country. It always will. But what was important last night is what the vice president Wilson said, hey, we have to be concerned about innocent lives being lost as well. So how you conduct a war is important, as well as the fact that we're supporting you. How you do that in terms of minimizing the lives of those innocent people, that's also important. I think she made that point very clearly.
Well, Mr. Cohen, we're meeting today on the 11th of September. A pretty remarkable 23 years later to wake up this morning, those of us who live anywhere between Boston and Washington, D.C., to note the weather today. It felt and looked exactly like it did the morning of 23 years ago. I had an opportunity to talk with Mark Schweiker, the former governor of Pennsylvania, who became governor because of 9/11 when Tom Ridge went to the Homeland Security Agency. And he emphasized what we need to do to stay vigilant as we mark 23 years. Here's what he said.
On this gorgeous Wednesday, it's also about proper reflection, commemorating those who perished, and relative to Homeland Security, that it's more than just a moniker. I think 9/11 can be not just about commemoration, even though that's the lion's share of the emotional aspect today. Staying on top of our Homeland Security game and remaining vigilant is essential as well.
Mr. Secretary, people under 25, maybe even 30, don't have great memories of this. It wasn't part of their life. They don't have the worldview that someone may have who experienced that, remembers the fear and the confusion of that day, the day the world changed for a lot of Americans. And I wonder, to the extent that we try to advance the lessons learned on 9/11, if the greatest tribute to those who lost, those who died that day, and the first responders who followed, is to continue that vigilance that the governor talks about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's why memory and memorials are so critical to our lives. If we don't remember what has happened in the past, we're likely to have it happen again. And that's why it's important to remind people, those who were not alive at that time, go back and look at the films. Look what happened in the attack upon those towers. Look what happened when the Pentagon was attacked. Look what happened to those brave first responders going into that rubble, that fiery collapse of those two twin towers. And look at the courage they showed running into fire and running away from it. We have to remember that to always keep in mind the world is dangerous. There are people in this world who would like to replicate what happened on 9/11, and we have to remain vigilant, and we have to remember those who lost their lives in the protection of our security. It was a somber day today, but one that we have to keep repeating, reminding ourselves.